Hello and welcome to another edition of Career Magic with Nitin Kulkarni. Today I'm going to talk about an air crash, a real air crash. When my son Siddharth was quite young, not even 10, actually much younger than 10, he used to watch the Discovery Channel, and one program in particular always used to hold his attention. There was a program called Aircraft Investigations on the Discovery Channel. Now, many people I know don't like to watch that show. Because if you travel even once in a while by air, watching that show can be a little bit scary. It talks about air crashes and their investigations. But Siddharth used to love it, and he would just be riveted to the TV. And once in a while, I used to sit with him and watch the show. I enjoyed it quite a bit as well. And on one of those shows, they were showing that episode actually had some personal lessons. Now, how does an aircraft, air crash episode, how come that has personal lessons? I'll tell you how. Now, that episode was about an aircraft from Crossair. Now, Crossair was a Swiss airline, no longer in business, but we are talking about a flight that happened on 24th November 2001, and Crossair flight 3597 that night was flying from Berlin to Zurich. So that flight is about it's about a little over an hour for that aircraft. And so it took off from Berlin, and it had 33 people on board, 5 crew members, and the crew included the 2 pilots. There was Captain Lutz, and there was First Officer Lowerer. So these were the 2 pilots. Captain Lutz was a very experienced pilot. He had over 19,500 hours of flying time, a bulk of those as a captain. The other person, the First Officer Lowerer, was not very experienced. He had probably less than 500 hours of total flying time, so much less experienced. So the flight took off, and when it got close to Zurich, it was supposed to land, and Zurich airport has what is called an instrument landing system, which just directs. So if you put the aircraft into that mode, the instrument landing system at the airport directs the aircraft into the airport for a smooth automated landing. But what happened that night was it was past 10 p.m. and Zurich airport at that time had a system where after 10, if you are approaching over residential areas, that was not allowed because of noise pollution control. So they had to take a different approach, and using that approach, this instrument landing system was not available. So they had to switch to a manual landing using their sight and so on, and their own instruments, and the air traffic control would guide them in. Now, in that mode, what happens is that there's a lot of protocols that aircrafts have to follow from a safety perspective, and they follow them religiously. That's why air crashes are so rare. Now, at Zurich airport has what is called an MDA, a minimum descent, DESCENT, minimum descent altitude. So whenever you are landing manually, what you have to do is you cannot bring the aircraft below the MDA, below the minimum descent altitude for that airport until you can visually sight the runway. So that's a safety procedure. Because around the airport, in that vicinity, there might be tall structures and so on. So you stay above the MDA until you can visually sight the runway, and then you can come below that and land the aircraft. Now, as they were approaching the airport, Captain Lutz actually reduced the altitude of the aircraft quite rapidly. Much more rapidly than he should have, and reached the MDA, which I think, if I remember right, was 2,400 feet. He reached the MDA, and the first officer Lutz, who was the junior person, realized that and then reminded the captain. Now that we have sort of reached there, and there was some conversation between the two pilots, but the aircraft continued to descend, and it actually ended up crashing into a hillside not very far from the airport, and 24 out of the 33 people died, including these two pilots. Now, as is the rule, this air crash was investigated very thoroughly by the Swiss Aircraft Investigation Authority, and they came to some conclusions, and they fixed the problem as pilot error. And the problem was that the plane descended too rapidly and went a little bit off course and crashed into this hillside, causing the problem. One of the things that they looked at during their investigation was the cockpit voice recorder, which records all the conversations that occur in the cockpit and between the pilots and the air traffic control. And during this investigation, they realized that the second officer had spotted the fact that they had descended too much, or they were about to descend too much, and had pointed it out. But he had pointed it out very tentatively, and what he said was, he asked the captain, okay, we have reached the MDA, can we see the runway? And the captain said, yes, we can see the runway, even though the runway was not in sight. And the first officer knew this because the runway was not in sight. The hill actually was blocking their view where they were when this conversation took place. But the first officer did not press the issue and say that, yeah, I can't see the runway, what are we doing, we shouldn't go below, whatever. So that sort of conversation never took place, and they ended up crashing into the hillside with 24 people losing their lives. Now, all these aircraft investigation processes end with some recommendations. One of the very interesting recommendations that was made by this board which investigated this air crash was behavioral training for pilots. Think about it. Air crash happened. One of the recommendations is mandatory behavioral training for pilots. What was this behavioral training? This behavioral training was regarding enabling pilots, giving them the skills, developing skills in pilots where they could disagree with seniors more forcefully, so they could be more assertive when they disagreed, so that a proper conversation could take place in situations like these. Secondly, the training also would address the needs of more senior people to make them little more open-minded about having these sorts of conversations with junior officers. So the key here, recommendation here, and the cause of the crash was lack of assertiveness on the part of the first officer, and that was the basis for this recommendation, and since then this sort of training happens for pilots. Now, this sort of thing happens everywhere, anywhere. So this is a pilot in hospitals, in the corporate world, anywhere. You always have this situation where senior people and junior people have to interact, have to have a conversation, and sometimes the junior person may be aware of something which is a risk or a problem or an issue which could derail the project, etc., but they don't speak up. The real fear always is the fear of negative consequences of speaking up in front of a senior person. And this can lead to disasters. Lives may not always be lost. In hospitals, lives may be lost. In fact, there are documented cases. There is a documented case that I read in a book where the wrong leg of a patient was amputated, and at least one person on the operating table suspected, a junior person, that something wrong was happening but did not speak up and allowed the surgeon to go on and perform the operation. Think about it, how bad the consequence is. But in the corporate world, what happens is the consequences may not be that serious, or maybe businesses may fail as a result of these sorts of things. Your projects may fail, products that are being launched may not actually achieve the required success because people did not speak up about issues, problems and risks when they could have. So this is a big problem. So what are the lessons for us from this air crash? As corporate citizens, if we are managing teams, it is our job to encourage, foster and nurture dissent. D-I-S-S-E-N-T, dissent, disagreement must be nurtured, must be encouraged. As managers, we've got to create an environment where if someone disagrees, we give them a pat on the back and say well done, and have a meaningful open discussion around it. Many really good companies, I know that the operating principles and values within companies like Google and Amazon talk about open conversations, about dissent and encouraging dissent and disagreement for this reason. Because when that happens, better decisions are made. So as managers, we've got to create environments within our ecosystem, within our teams, where dissent can take hold and people are encouraged to do it, so that the best possible decisions are made. There are lessons for us as individuals to become more assertive if we want to be more impactful, and you must have noticed this from your own experience. I have. My very first manager was a guy who never hesitated to disagree openly, even with very senior people, but he had the skills to do it. So that is the lesson for us, is to behave, to create this mindset, to develop this mindset where we will speak up. However, in order to do that, we need some skills. So the fear of negative consequences is real if we don't do it right. So we have to approach the topic directly, but we have to approach it in a manner that it leads to conversations, it leads to better decisions, not debate, argument and a problem with relationships. So we not only do we have to develop a mindset to disagree and speak up, be more assertive, that is a very important emotional intelligence skill, but we also must develop the dialogue skills, things like emotional expression. So in this case, first officer Lorer could have said, you know what, I am very uncomfortable, I am afraid that we are going down to below the MDA and I think we've got a problem, something like that. So your ability to express your emotion and to talk about this. So there are dialogue skills which I will talk about in another video, and I run workshops, full day workshops, where we do this development of these sorts of dialogue skills that help you become more assertive. So those are the lessons for us as managers and as individuals from this cross-air crash. So hopefully you developed some, so hopefully this was valuable in terms of raising our level of consciousness to do these things. If you like this video, do like it, subscribe to my channel. I keep posting these sorts of videos from my life experiences, and see you again next time on another edition of Career Magic.